Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
Okay, so with respect to the Defense Production Act, we're going to zero in on this particular discussion with one of my long-term business confidants and friend, Jim de Vries, is going to introduce himself here in a second. But for the purposes of this episode, we're going to drill in very much around supply chain risk and resilience with one of the best experts I know out there with how all these things come into play and the things we should be thinking about. So with that, Jim, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, thanks, Ron, for having me today. I really appreciate it. This is a very great subject and something very dear to my heart. Just to give you a little bit of background, I've actually been working in the energy industry since even when I was in college, when I worked in research and development for an energy and gas turbine technology. We worked on finding new ways to develop new energy sources back then in the 1980s. So this is something near and dear to my heart. I entered the Naval Nuclear Operations Program and went through that program and then joined GE Energy. So this is, again, very close to my heart. I was in Asia, kicking off Asia in the 90s, and as a commercial engineer, as well as a senior application engineer. Then I went into consulting in the early 2000s and consulted in automotive, electronics, security, and many other disciplines. And then in mid-2000s, I got into supply chain management big time, starting up a 4PL. And that 4PL turned into about $1 billion worth of freight that we managed globally. And then a foray in 2010 was becoming a supply chain transformation architect for Air Products in 2010 to 2014. And then after that, just about in that time frame, I met a good friend of mine now, Greg Schlegel, and he started getting into supply chain risk management. And then he wrote a book called Supply Chain Risk Management with Dr. Robert Trend, Emergent Discipline. And then in the past 3 years, Greg and I have really worked closely together in the supply chain risk management field and incorporating a number of different tools.
Right, cool. So I think you guys are involved. I've known Greg, of course, for a really long time through my involvement with APIX now, ASCM, and Greg and I have been friendly discussion buddies for over 20 years. One of the organizations you're involved with is the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium, and I find that pretty interesting. Can you just take 10 or 15 seconds about the consortium?
Yeah, the consortium has over 23 partners that focus on supply chain risk management. It provides education, consulting, and SaaS solutions with that mix. There's over 2,000 risk pros, as Greg would say, across the world, covering 23 countries, and we provide online assessments, online education, and face-to-face education, as well as consulting. And one of the latest projects we had was working for the government and setting up a strategic supply chain risk management SaaS solution for some very large defense companies.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing that. So pivoting back, was I was putting together the plans for this MetaPod episode, I really wanted to kind of drill into different aspects. Let's go back to, last year in 2023 with the Biden administration launching 30 different initiatives. There's a whole lot we could talk about, but we're going to draw this down pretty tightly around supply chain risk and resilience. So I'd like you to do now, Jim, with our audience for maybe the next, 5 to 10 minutes max, is just kind of talk about, in your mind, of all the things you could be paying attention to, offering some kind of a diagnostic, in your mind, the sorts of like the top 3 things, if you will, that they should be considering or organizations should be looking at as either an opportunity or a threat. An opportunity is something that can leverage and really drive better results in the future, or a threat from the perspective of you're going to miss out or your competition get involved and actually use that to take advantage. Could you just elaborate a bit around what kind of a diagnostic element? And then we're going to come back after that, talk about what to do, or perhaps even commingle that a little bit as you go. So,
Yeah,
that.
thanks, Ron. And so from a diagnostic perspective, you really need to look at your supply chain. And as we always say, you got to map it end to end first. And in doing that, you're going to be looking at where are your materials being sourced. And we're not talking about your direct suppliers, but your end tiered supplier. And in this world, we really get into rare earth elements, especially in this TPA Act, is that there's quite a number of raw earth materials that are mined in some third world countries and sometimes in some places that are very tough to get to. Back in the 80s and 90s, we stopped mining those materials in the U.S. and we started mining those across the world. And those are critical for all of our infrastructure, from electricity and the grid to nuclear power to electronics. So we call them the REEs, the rare earth elements. That's one area to focus on. The second area is the sourcing of materials. Do you have transparency on where your materials are coming from?
Yeah, and to be clear about this, it's the sourcing of all materials, not just rare earths. That's part of what I'm pushing for here is, no matter what kind of business you're involved with here in North America, whether you're, making products or even consuming lots of product, we need to actually source. This is a broad topic and really potentially impacts just about any sort of organization.
Absolutely. So getting to understand where those are sourced from and making sure you have at least a second source outside of your single source. So single sourcing is pretty dangerous, especially not only with a company, but for a particular country. So if you're sourcing everything out of China and you don't have a backup source in India, Indonesia, Africa, then you're going to be at risk. And what's happening, of course, we're having a lot of risks in this world, the VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. All these things are happening with the geopolitical landscape. The socioeconomic risks are coming in. And the question is, are you able to respond faster than your nearest competitor? And in the U.S., we tend to lag behind the rest of the world on finding alternative sources. So that's a big risk for the U.S. overall.
And so the diagnostic is take a step back here and really take a look at, all the decisions been made in the last 15, 20 years. And are you basically setting yourself up for some real challenges around where you sourced or being too narrowly sourced?
That's right.
For key things that are inputs to your business's needs.
That's right. And with this geopolitical world now, where a lot of we're really fighting against China and Russia for those rare earth elements and all the intermediary steps all the way through it. So really having that mapped out and having a risk alert system is really imperative. And that's your outside in. A lot of folks have...
That's not just rare earths. It's all the core inputs. It's all the organization consumes to be successful.
That's right. So all these sub-assemblies, all your partners, all your suppliers, but also your customers. A lot of people sit there and say supply chain is procurement. It's called supply chain, but it's actually, it goes all the way to your customers. Just like we heard when the missile hit in Afghanistan, they found out that 75% of the components were made in America. And so we're shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak, here with we just don't even know where our stuff is going. So it's not just the supplier side, it's the customer side also that can hurt you. And with the government wanting to crack down, back in 2019, the government said, we want to stop all of the materials coming from our competitors, so to speak, the Soviet bloc, let's say, in China, and we want to stop all that. And quite frankly, they found that it's really, really difficult. Very, very difficult from a traceability perspective, but slowly we have to unwind that clock. And a lot of folks say, well, how did we get here? We got here from the 80s and 90s where we used to make everything. We made everything soup to nuts here. And in order to keep our inflation down, we started sourcing around the world. Now we went to the lowest cost country, China. Before the 90s, or in the 90s, China started transferring all of that to them. So now, instead of us having a half a dozen or a dozen countries where we're sourced from, today we're sourced from China. Everything goes through China. And a lot of folks don't understand that. It's like, oh, we're going to stop buying this we're going to move our operations from China to Thailand, let's say. Well, you move to Thailand, that's great, but you still need to get the stuff from China because they're the only ones who make 50% or 30% of your subassembly. So it's not that easy. It's going to take a lot to unwind that. And because they have scale, they're going to be the cheapest one on the block. And so are we going to take inflation or are we going to go to China? That's the $1 million question or $1 billion question now, maybe $1 trillion.
Exactly. That's pretty interesting. You know, I like your hypothesis that, you know, with the COVID pandemic, you know, tripping a huge spiral of inflationary activities going on, of course, resulting, you know, the actions by the feds and increasing interest rates, which, you know, it looks like it's coming back the other way, or at least, you know, putting the pause button on all that. Mm-hmm. But, you know, the U.S. economy showed evidence of actually weathering the storm inflationary wise and actually getting it back under control much more quickly and easily than other countries. Part of that's because of all these old sourcing decisions been made. But now as things change, you know, the pressure goes toward, you know, protecting North American supply chains, the vital delivery of food, medicine, you know, emergency response, being able to, you know, take care of our own people in our own countries and not be, you know, victimized by these global issues. That's a balance we're going to have to strike.
It is. It is. It's a real balancing act. It's like, how do we do that? So, of course, we have India and we have Africa and we always have Indonesia that we can go back to and South Asia. And so that's what the fight is. Of course, Taiwan is a pivot point on the electronic side. We are building fabs in the U.S. Intel is building some fabs. So we are going at it, but it's going to take us a while to regain our ground and gravitas, so to speak, of alternate sources. But again, how do you stop inflation? How do you keep that down is going to be the greatest challenge. And it's really sad to me is South America and Central America, because here we have all these countries close to us that unfortunately we're not able to capitalize on because of the geopolitical problems in those countries. So it may be that Africa is more stable before South America is stable. So, you know, the geopolitical piece of this is, you know, a lot of people sit there and say, it's only within my four walls I need to worry about. It's becoming less and less so that you can just worry about what's in your four walls. And remember, one strategic risk event that occurs can wipe out your net income for the year. And 2 or 3 of those big events, if you're not positioned right, you're going to go under. And that's the biggest risk. And if you're moving your suppliers, you're at risk. If your customers are changing, you're at risk. So have you really mapped through these? Have you done your business continuity planning? Have you mapped out your risks? Are you prepared? You only have to be faster than your nearest competitor, you know, the bear in the woods.
You just said something really important, and we're more than halfway through our allocated time for this episode, but I'd like to pause for a second. And I was kind of looking for, like, in your mind, of all the things we could focus on from a diagnostic perspective, what would be like the top 3 things to really pay attention to? And, you know, I was kind of picking up here and taking a couple of notes as we go. Certainly, where you're sourced, why you're sourced there, and then start to challenge the paradigms. Is it time to carefully challenge all these old decisions we've made and really think about strategically where we are and where we're not with respect to inbound supply, and then coupled with customer, who are our customers that we need to sell to? Do we have things we have to carefully consider there? Do we have to get rid of some of our customers and find new markets, right, et cetera?
That's right.
Well, what would be the third core thing in your mind from a diagnostic?
Well, I think it's kind of tied into that is the solvency question. And the cash flow, as well as your customers and suppliers' cash flow, using techniques like the Altman Z score is a very easy way to find out if a supplier is going under or a customer is going under. So there are folks that are forensic accountants that can do that for you, and that's dynamic. We really don't know. It's interesting when you look at the M&A world. There's a good pulse is to say, are there a lot of M&As going on there right now? There seem to be drying up right now. It's not hot right now. But when the M&As start increasing, that probably means there's more risk in your supply chain. So where are your suppliers and customers positioned? Is that market increasing, decreasing? Is it settling down? That financial perspective is really, really key and very often overlooked with just trying to deal with the day-to-day.
All right. So here's what I'd like to do here. Let's take about the next 4 or 5 minutes. And I'd like you to delve a little bit deeper into what to do. I mean, we talked about a few of the things about what to do. You've done the diagnostic to determine this, in fact, you've got a problem, or it's going to be a real problem. Or if we fail to do something about this, remain complacent, for example, with all sourcing decisions, we're going to get left behind, left in the dust. So that's what the diagnostic is about. So force us to critically think through, what is it we do need to do differently. So I'd like to focus on what to do now for the remaining, 3 or 4 minutes here before we get into the wrap up.
Sure. So I'd say the number one thing is education. Do your people know how to spell supply chain? Very often we're making decisions and we don't know how to spell supply chain, let alone risk management. So we always like to jump to a shiny object and say, oh, we're going to build a control tower and fix all this. But nobody knows what supply chain means. They can't even, let alone risk management. So we're really proponents of education and making sure that everybody's speaking the same language. Every company has its own language. So what is your supply chain language in your company? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do you make decisions? How do you make risk decisions? Are you of the nature to say every quarter we bring up all the things that went wrong and we talk about them for an hour in our corporate meeting and then we do nothing about them? That's very dangerous. And so we got to start talking about this. You can start with some very easy business continuity planning. Just where are your risks? You can hire a company to come in and you can get an outside-in view of your strategic risks. You can buy that, but then you can also start tracking your tactical and operational risks. And then you need to mitigate those risks. You need to create a risk register, and then you need to manage those risks in that risk register. And then you have to, just like you have alarm drills, you need to go, what are we going to do? If this risk happens, what are we going to do? And once people are practiced on that, then when you do have a risk, whether it's in the risk register or not, and you do have a continuity plan around that, whether you have it or not, you know how to build it and you can build it fast. And you have the team, who's going to do it. Again, you're only as good as you are if you're faster than your nearest competitor. So that.
Yeah, let me interrupt here. And, let's also talk about resiliency.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a fancy word that, people, it's all risk, we kind of get that. But what do we mean by resiliency and how is that interwoven? Maybe you could expand a little bit, at least in your opinion, around what good resiliency practices look like and how that links back to what you just said.
Yeah, really, the resiliency piece is how are you going to manage those risks, right? And do you have plans? Do you have mitigation plans? And resiliency is that risk is your friend. How do you make risk to be your friend? Because the companies that capitalize on risk are the companies that come out on top. The people who avoid risk and try to hide risk are going to be the companies that go under. So the question is, do you want to be leading or lagging your industry? A lot of folks go, well, it costs us too much to that. The most common comment is it costs us too much to look at all the risks. We can't fathom that. But how do you manage those risks? It's not, you can't manage 100% of the risk. It's how you manage those risks. And
right.
if you block yourself and say, I'm not going to deal with it, then you're going to fall behind, because if your competitor says, I'm going to capitalize on that risk, and you're going to say, I'm going to ignore that risk, then they're going to get the competitive edge, because the customer is sitting there saying they're struggling through that same risk event. Let's say it's a strategic outside-in risk. They're struggling. Who can respond faster, you or your competitor, to hit that supply chain? I think the automotive industry, Toyota, and a lot of these automotive companies, all of them really responded very quickly to the COVID risks. Even when they stopped getting their chips, they responded relatively fast compared to other industries. But it is aligned to industry. You just have to be faster than your nearest competitor. In the U.S., our competitor, if you're all your competitors in the U.S., the good news is everybody's complacent. But
yeah, so let me just butt in here for a second. We need to move into wrap up, and obviously we could go off for a really long time. But it sounds like you would agree that with respect to the Defense Production Act, there's some stuff going on there that you don't have to invent all this and figure it out, right? We can leverage and tap into what's going on across industries. You know, we've got the Defense Production Act. One of the specific initiatives under that is improving supply chain resiliency for organizations that operate in North America. And so I know, we could talk quite a bit about that. I think it'd probably be good to stop there, because obviously you might come back and talk more about this. If we get a strong reaction, folks want to learn more about it, we can certainly come back and start digging a little bit deeper into the how-tos. So with that, I'd like to move into wrap up here, and maybe be willing to take a couple minutes here at most and just talk a little bit about, people want to collaborate with you. How do they get in touch with you, and any last minute thoughts around resources available to them to tackle these challenges?
Yeah. So the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium website is up there. So please do reach out. There's a lot of information. We have a free online assessment to look at your risks, and it's process. It's a maturity model assessment. So it's very easy to take. 20, 30 minutes, have 2 or 3 of your folks in your company take that. That's a great way just to get your feet wet, is to how you look at supply chain management and the risk around it. Then we have the next layer. We have online training, but we also have a supply chain risk and resiliency assessment, which is a little bit more heady if you are wanting to take on to that next step. So those are some of the next steps that people can take to learn a little bit more about supply chain risk management. What
if somebody wants to reach you?
If they want to reach me, they can just say, come out to J de Vries at consultingeig.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn, pretty easy also.
All right. Well, in that case, thank you for joining us, Jim. This is amazing as usual. And I want to thank our audience for bearing with us and listening in, and join us for the next episode.
Thanks, Ron, for having me. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.